All right, I think we've reached over 100 attendees, so I'm gonna kind of just start things off. So, welcome to the Presidential Plenary on Sustainability. My name is Jennifer Ho. I'm a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm president of the Association for Asian American Studies. And I've actually worn, let's see if you can see it, I've worn my T-shirt especially for today by Sandra Oh, because I think that especially now during our first virtual conference, during a time when there is rampant anti-Asian racism, that it is really important for us to remember that being Asian American, being Pacific Islander, being scholars who work on Asian American studies, being artists and activists of Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies, this is something to celebrate. This is something that I feel deeply honored to be president of the association in this moment. And I'm so grateful to all of the panelists that we have here today. You can actually find their longer bios on page 20 of the conference program, which is PDF page 11. So I'm going to do the briefest of introductions because I want to hear from them this topic of sustainability, and the conference, the panel description for this presidential plenary is also in the program on page 20. So I'm going to begin in the order in which people are speaking, which actually happens to be the alpha order of people's last names. So we have Craig Santos Perez from the University of Hawaii. We have Min Song from Boston College. We have Linda Vo from the University of California, Irvine. And so they're going to be speaking in this order. Everyone's going to take about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So for those of you who are not familiar with the webinar format, the chat is actually open. You can feel free to message one another individually. You can feel free to send in links or observations to the entire attendance group, and we're up at 139 attendees so far. If you have a question, please use the Q&A. The Q&A will be visible to everyone. It's hard for us to manage the chat and see your questions because it could get buried in conversation. So please use the Q&A for any questions that you might have. And without further ado, I pass it to Craig.
Well, Hafaday, aloha, greetings to everyone. I'm so honored to be part of this session. Thank you for the invitation. And I want to send, of course, my acknowledgements to the Kanaka Maoli people, Native Hawaiians here, as I am zooming in from Oahu. I also want to send my love and solidarity to all the Asian American scholars who've been doing so much important public education, as well as so much difficult work during these times. I've been really inspired by everything I've read online and a lot of the webinars that I've attended over the past couple of weeks. So thank you, and I'm just so honored. So I wanted to start with the first question of this session, thinking about how to make AAAS more sustainable. And some ideas really apply to all academic organizations during this time. And I think the first thing that many associations need to really consider is transitioning to a biennial in-person conference as opposed to an annual in-person conference. And I think moving then to a virtual, nearly carbon neutral conference in odd years would be a really great way to reduce the carbon footprint of all academic organizations. I think for the biennial in-person conference, if that is a transition made, obviously it would be important to work with host facilities to reduce the carbon footprint, all kinds of simple things we can do to reducing printed materials, name tags, bringing our own coffee mugs and water bottles, connecting with local food organizations serving mostly vegetarian meals, all kinds of little things. And there's a lot of writing on nearly carbon neutral conferences out there. And I know this year's conference is good practice in that. I think it's also important to provide resources for members to offset our impacts in local communities, providing links to orgs focused on sustainability in whatever communities that conferences will be held in person. And again, those are just small, simple things, but I think important to consider. Secondly, I think AAAS and again, other associations need to encourage and support more research and activities into environmental studies, sustainability, environmental justice, and climate change. Some ideas, if AAAS might be landing some much needed funds, could be to offer grants for new research projects that explore the intersections between Asian American studies, environmental justice, sustainability, and so on. I think offering grants as well for grad students and faculty who want to engage in community projects with Asian American environmental organizations and or communities would be another great way to encourage this kind of work. As you update the website, I think it'd be great to include resources on Asian American scholarship that focuses on environmental issues, as well as links to Asian American organizations that are devoted to sustainability. Lastly, I think it would be great to establish a new book prize category, focus on Asian American studies and environmental justice or environmental humanities, ecological studies, and so on. I think that'll be a nice category to add to the already robust award categories offering. So those are some very practical ideas. I want to move now to thinking about some things we can do to create more sustainable relationships between Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies. I've written 2 short essays over the years, both titled Reading Across the Acronym, published in 2012 and 2020. I was very fortunate to attend the Comparative Ethnic Studies program at UC Berkeley, where I got to study with Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, Kathy Sunitsa Choi, Sao-Ling Wong, and Elaine Kim. And I learned so much about Asian American studies, literature, and theory, and developed a lot of really meaningful friendships with Asian American scholars. And so in those 2 essays, I kind of wanted to honor, my own training and education and friendships to really advocate for us to read across the acronym, as I put it. So many Pacific Islander scholars are not really well versed in Asian American studies, and many Asian American scholars are not well versed in Pacific Islander studies. So I think, just reading each other's work is a great way for us to get to know our historical connections, comparative racializations, there's so many mixed race Asian American Pacific Islander peoples, including myself and my wife and their kids. And I think it's important, that we honor those connections. And then to think about, our cross-cultural solidarities, especially in relation to our experiences of a war in Asia and the Pacific, of US imperialism, of trans-Pacific migration diaspora, environmental injustice, and of course now climate change, which is impacting our region pretty severely. There are so many great people who are doing amazing work across the acronym. I'm really excited to read Erin Suzuki's new book, Ocean Passages, Navigating Asian American and Pacific Islander Literature. I've been really inspired by the folks doing Asian settler colonialism research here in Hawaii. I got to attend the plenary yesterday, which I thought was really important. So many great folks doing critical refugee studies here in the Pacific, critical trans-Pacific studies, quite a few scholars on Guam doing Filipino solidarity, and they have a great panel, I believe, on Saturday called Filipinos for Guahan, which I'm looking forward to attending. And one particular organization I want to shout out, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, which has been one of the few organizations that I think has been truly honoring both sides of this acronym. So I want to honor those groups and just cite my essays, and I hope folks will check it out and really continue to build solidarities across the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. With all that said, I want to, however, acknowledge that there are a lot of organizations that claim to be API or APAI or APA and so on, which instead have caused a lot of harm in our communities, a lot of erasure, confusion, completion, and sublimations. And so I also want to advocate for continued disaggregation of this particular label. We need, especially during this time of COVID, a lot of Pacific Islander organizations advocating for a disaggregation of data, which is really important, disaggregation of certain organizations, even of hashtags such as the hashtag Stop AAPI Hate, which has caused a lot of conflation and problems. And even our upcoming Heritage Month, which is something that I've been really active in, but I also really dread because there are so many events and reading lists and webinars that are all about API, but are really not about PIs at all. And I think it's important, both for AAAS to continue to work towards this aggregation as well. Hawaiian and Pacific Island Studies is not a subcomponent of Asian American Studies, as it's sometimes articulated as, but it is a different discipline. And I am excited to share that there is a consortium of Pacific Islander Studies programs, departments, and faculty, which I'm involved in, to form a Oceania and Pacific Islander Studies Association. And so hopefully in a few years, we'll be able to put on our first conference as well. And I think it would be great to collaborate across organizations as opposed to having one subsumed within the other. Now, along that same lines, I think it's important for Asian American Pacific Islanders communities to have critical and difficult conversations that we have not had as much. During these times, I think Pacific Islander communities really need to come together and have conversations about anti-Asianness, anti-Asian racism, hate, and violence within the Pacific Islands and within Pacific Islander communities. Last year, we saw a lot of wonderful events talking about anti-Blackness within Pacific communities, but I've only seen one event so far this year looking at anti-Asianness within Pacific communities. And so I think more of these conversations need to happen because it is a big problem here in the Pacific. At the same time, I think Asian American communities really need to reckon with the histories of Asian imperialism, settler colonialism, militarism, extractivism, capitalism, and environmental injustice caused in the Pacific Islands by many Asian countries. And so that is, a lot of the conversations usually about US imperialism in the Pacific, but we need more conversations about Asian imperialism in the Pacific as well. And I believe having these difficult conversations, disaggregating the AAPI label, and continuing to build genuine solidarities across the acronym will lead to more sustainable kinships that will strengthen our respective communities in our shared struggles and our abilities to not only imagine, but also to bring into being decolonial, demilitarized, and sustainable futures for Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander peoples. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing the other presentations and to our conversation after.
It's hard to follow Craig and to have Linda come after me. I feel like I'm being sandwiched between two giants. I love the suggestions and the practical nature of Craig's talk. Mine's going to be a little less practical, but I hope it'll be useful. I think I poured all of the practical advice I have into a piece I just recently published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I made the strongest case I could muster for the expansion of ethnic studies after Atlanta. And at the risk of sounding like I'm self-promoting, I really do want to encourage you to read it if you can, and make use of it, because that essay was channeling the work we do here together at AAAS and really championing that work. I thought of the audience as being administrators and chairs and tenure line faculty, all the gatekeepers. who have to be convinced about the utility of the work we do in ethnic studies, and particularly in Asian American studies, and also separately in Pacific Islander studies. I'm grateful to have had that opportunity to make that argument, but there was one passage I wrote in the draft version that didn't make it into the published version, for which I'm very sorry. I'm going to read you that passage because I think it speaks directly to the issues I want to share with you today. I wrote, I'd love for programs and departments in ethnic studies to resist the split between the humanities and the natural sciences. Environmental issues in particular must involve the discussion of race, an issue I'm especially passionate about as a member of my school's environmental studies program. Such programs do not yet exist, but I hope that schools will take on this challenge and model for others how productive this approach can be. I think the very fact that this passage was omitted speaks to the very challenge I was writing about. As far as I know, there is no program of race and environmental studies. And maybe the very idea of such a program might seem to us unlikely or even absurd, but why is that the case? Why do these two areas of study seem so incompatible that we can't imagine them, or we have trouble imagining them as comprising a single academic unit? Now, I'm not asking this question to assert that such a program should exist, but really to pose a challenge for us. Many of you in the audience have probably already read Karente Yamashita's Through the Arc of the Rainforest, in which a giant pool of nearly indestructible plastic is discovered underneath the Amazon forest. Everyone in the novel wants to know how it got there, including academics and journalists. So at every gathering, no matter who's speaking, the question always circles back to that plastic. What about the Matakau? What does your talk have to do with it? What can you tell us about it? For us, the Matakau is climate change. It is the singular historical event that we must all reckon with and find responses to in some way. It touches everything and it affects everything we might be interested in studying. All of our questions and research and thinking should circle back to this topic in some way. I also completely believe that no progress on efforts at mitigation and adaptation can be made if we're not also talking about race, capaciously defined. Race is also a historical phenomena that touches everything, especially if we think in terms of settler colonialism. But despite the ways in which these two topics are interlocked, they also seem prized apart. The earth and environmental scientists are huddled on their side of the room, worried sick by what their data is showing them. And then the race and ethnic studies are on the other side of the room, huddled together and worried sick by the racial turmoil we are encountering. It's important for both sides of these rooms to start talking to each other and to think about what each group brings to the other. How does thinking about race help all of us to think about the challenges that face the promotion of knowledge about climate change and effective responses? And how does thinking about climate change recast the framing, the scope, and the urgency of our thinking about race and racism? Such questions are easier asked than responded to. And I found this to be true after Atlanta, when my grief led me to become much more vocal than I'd ever been. I was tweeting about anti-Asian racism, I was writing op-eds, I was speaking at events at my school, and I was bothering administrators. I even wrote a 1,200-word essay about the need for ethnic studies and insisted on reading it to my dean when we had a meeting. And then after the meeting, I emailed it to him just to make sure he knew I meant business. For weeks, I've been focused on this issue and thinking about what I could do to address it. But in the midst of all of this activity and organizing, it was hard to feel a sense of urgency around the topic of climate change. That seemed far away and largely irrelevant, while curricular reform and program building was immediate. The latter was an area I could exert some influence on, make some kind of response to that would have some kind of effect on the racism we're enduring now, but the former seemed remote and hard to hold in mind, much less feel like I could make a difference on those topics right now. So here's one reason why it might be difficult to integrate my concern with racism with my environmental concerns. I've written a whole book on this, but apparently writing the book wasn't enough. The task is difficult. The book isn't out yet. It'll be out in January. There's no model for how to do this. There's no frame or discourse or habit of thought that drives attention together to bring discussions about racism and discussions about climate change together. And it's possible that another challenge we face is that climate change isn't the Matacao in the sense that it doesn't have that similar tangible presence. Climate change doesn't have the immediate weirdness that Yamashita's imaginary plastic has in the novel. Instead, all we have is the middle of the story. And in many ways, we are in the middle of the story. And whether we realize it or not, the racism we are experiencing is a part of that story. What this means is that whatever might seem inevitable about our present to those living several decades in the future just doesn't seem inevitable to us now. I really do believe that anything can happen. And one of the things holding us back from engaging with the many challenges associated with climate change and racism is the limitations of our own imagination. We just can't imagine how bad things can get. Maybe our worst case scenarios aren't bad enough. And we can't convince ourselves that we can make better worlds. And not just better worlds, but stupendously, wildly, deliriously better worlds. It's intense to try to open up the horizon of our imagination in this way, to see the range of what's possible as occupying such extremes. It's so much safer and easier to assume some middle ground, and to live on with an impoverished imagination. So the way I understand our job as critics and academics and scholars and activists and organizers, at least provisionally, is to hew to the more difficult past and to insist on occupying a present of terrifying possibilities for what the future holds for us. Our worst case scenarios need to be more terrifying, and our best case scenarios need to be more utopic. And we shouldn't think that there's some safe middle ground of greatest likelihood. Anything is possible. All pathways radiate from the present with equal plausibility. And in order to imagine such possibilities, we need to think about how race affects whatever responses there may be to the environmental challenges facing all of us. And we must also think hard about the ways in which the worsening effects of climate change will exacerbate present-day racisms with potentially cascading political consequences. There is no way to imagine the kind of best case scenarios surrounding climate change that we need to imagine into being right now without also imagining greater racial equality and justice. So these thoughts finally beg the question for me, what terrifies us more? The worst case scenarios or the idea of making the world better? The latter, after all, will require more from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Min and Craig. I'm esteemed to be part of this panel with them. So I do want to start by saying thank you to Jennifer Ho and the AAAS for inviting me to be a speaker on this presidential plenary titled Sustainability, which I interpret broadly. Sustainability has been on our minds in a multiplicity of ways this past year. And I'm thinking about bodily sustainability since I just received my second vaccine a couple of days ago, and I'm definitely still feeling the side effects as I speak. As a graduate student, I saw the front stage of the AAAS when I attended my first conference in 1990 at UC Santa Barbara, organized by Su Cheng Chan, the second president of the AAAS. I saw the hard work occurring on the backstage when I served as a board member twice, representing the Pacific Northwest and then Southern California. I also co-chaired the AAAS conference with Rick Bonis in 2006, the first time it was held in the South in Atlanta. I've served on a number of other committees and then became AAAS president 3 presidencies ago. Each experience made me realize the incredible volunteer and collective labor that is needed year-round to keep the AAAS afloat. Of course, I want to give a shout out to Ana Gonzalez for her tireless commitment to sustaining the AAAS. The sustainability of the AAAS depends on the viability of Asian American studies. And the sustainability of Asian American studies is interlinked with the AAAS. The AAAS has been a safe, nurturing haven for many of us, students, faculty, community activists, and artists, renewing our energy and helping to advance our careers. It's been a vital space to build intellectual networks, facilitate mentorships, generate collaborative projects, provide opportunities for employment, and yes, even foster lifelong friendships. This is especially important for those of us who are the only one or one of the few Asian Americans on our campus. I don't have all the answers on how the AAAS can be more sustainable, but what I like to do is pose some questions to keep in mind in this current historical moment. It is an existential moment for Asian American studies and invariably for the AAAS. On my mind is Timothy Yu's reflections when he first asked the question in 2011, has Asian American studies failed? And his appeal for us to think about our role in the public sphere. We can generally agree that the AAAS has grown, with more graduate degrees being conferred in Asian American studies and more books in our fields being published in a wide range of disciplines. But does this mean Asian American studies is growing? We don't really know, since I don't think anyone's recently completed a comprehensive study of the field. One way to enumerate this is to examine faculty numbers. With the passing or retirement of pioneering scholars who built the field, have we replaced them? Are new FTEs or faculty positions growing, or are we just hiring contingent or part-time faculty, which poses a whole nother set of problems? Are private and public institutions admitting more grad students or hiring more faculty in our field? And are the number of courses, programs, or departments expanding, or have we plateaued? Having a department can be deceptive, since many, like mine, struggle to expand their FTEs, lack resources, and have a difficult time increasing the number of majors. Some units are being starved or are stagnant. Noticeable this year, there were a few job openings, and many are in the California State University system because of the new ethnic studies requirements. Additionally, are the faculty being hired only interested in advancing their own careers, or are they contributing to the field by mentoring a new generation of Asian American studies educators, or attending or giving back to the AAAS and its sustainability? Is Asian American studies and the AAAS relevant for this existential moment? Asians are hypervisible in popular culture, with literary text and Asian American authors gaining notoriety, and Asian bodies visually represented in K-pop and movies like Crazy Rich Asians, The Farewell, Parasite, Sound of Metal, Minari, and Raya. At the same time, the public is seeing images of the physical violence being inflicted upon gendered Asian bodies, which is juxtaposed with the model minority stereotype and the Asian dream cliches. While 74 million Americans voted for a white supremacist incumbent who used the Make America Great Again and America First slogans, they also significantly increased their online orders of products from China and Asia. We elected an Asian American and African American woman as vice president, but now we have an onslaught of Jim Crow voter suppression laws being passed or proposed, and we have redistricting struggles ahead. The COVID-19 pandemic only exacerbated inequities and exposed vulnerabilities. It is having devastating consequences on our communities, businesses, bodies, and psyches. Russell Jung, along with the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, are reporting the alarming surge in anti-Asian microaggressions and macroaggressions. So the sustainability of our physical well-being and mental health is under threat. How can the AAAS and Asian American Studies intervene and shape the public narrative and discourse, not just wait for crises to occur to educate the public on our histories and contemporary conditions? I just want to briefly discuss 5 areas. First, are we doing enough in our teaching to generate more informed voices? We recognize that this was an issue in 1992 with the Los Angeles uprising. In 2021, it's noticeable how the media is turning to Hollywood figures and what this says about who are the national spokespersons for Asian America. There are almost 20 million Asian American and Pacific Islanders of all backgrounds, and we need a spectrum of disaggregated voices to counter the disinformation and misinformation. We're skilled at teaching students to become academics, but how can we better pedagogically prepare those who will be future activists and community leaders? We're teaching the activism of the 1960s and 1970s, but how can we speak meaningfully to the complexities of the moment? Our students are the ones who will shape the narrative of how this historical moment of precarity and danger is both hauntingly continuous and distinct from critical markers, such as 1790, 1871, 1875, 1882, 1941, 1982, 1992, and 9/11, and the list goes on. Second, as we pivoted to virtual teaching, we had to rely even more on online research materials. In addition to producing secondary resources, how can we do more in collecting and shaping the availability of primary resources, such as oral histories, photographs, documents, and other archival materials? Using new technologies, how can we partner with universities, archives, museums, and historical societies to help tell our stories and make this base of knowledge more widely accessible to international audiences too? Third, I'm heartened to see Asian American Studies scholars intervening and providing correctives in various media forms for popular audiences. I'm not alone in thinking we have the right president at this moment, Jennifer Ho, who is social media savvy, and incoming president Pavan Dhingra, who has also written widely read editorials. Compared to even a decade ago, we have a range of professor pundits or public intellectuals, including Viet Thanh Nguyen, Erica Lee, Karthik Ramakrishnan, Janelle Wong, May Nai, Catherine Choi, Ellen Wu, Grace Kao, Claire Kim, Nadia Kim, Kevin Nadal, and Uyan Poon, just to name a few. And they're building upon the efforts of Ron Takaki, Gary Okahiro, and Evelyn Huda-Hart, amongst others. The recent list of Asian American Studies scholars willing to speak to the media that was generated included numerous younger scholars, which is so needed. We need folks to speak at the national level, but we also need those who can address regional issues at this watershed moment. But this work should be sustained beyond this year. Of course, there are inherent risks with working with the media. One can be misinterpreted, quotes can be taken out of context, or we can experience backlash. In many cases, we're starting with ground zero or 101 with each reporter before we can even provide in-depth or nuanced insights. For example, yes, we're predominantly first generation by 60%. Yes, we have experienced a long history of racial discrimination in this country. Yes, the model minority and perpetual foreigner perception is damaging. And yes, we are not monolithic. There's a definite art to distilling our research and analysis into short sound bites. However, on a positive note, we are at a point where concepts like white supremacy and institutionalized systemic racism do not need to be defended when we talk to a reporter. So beyond just Helen Zia, how can we partner with the Asian American Journalists Association to see what we can learn from them about being strategic and purposeful? Additionally, can we do more with those who work in film, TV, theater, podcasting, blogging, and other social media formats to get our stories out there and provide a counterbalance? Fourth, We can consider how the trajectory of our research or those we're mentoring are aligned with critical concerns that might advance advocacy work, or as some call it, research justice. In addition to the AAPI data website, can we better translate the multifaceted and intricate aspects of our academic research and writing so that it's accessible to a wider public? The AAAS has directly funded and produced a few scholarly projects, but can we do more? To answer one of the questions posed by Jennifer, for example, in terms of climate change and global warming, we can add to research by Julie C. and Lisa Park and others on environmental justice. How can we make more prominent the ways in which racism, militarism, colonialism, and capitalism is interconnected to forms of transnational violence, forced displacement, and ecological catastrophes? The AAAS is amplifying this theme this year, thanks to Amy and Lalani. We can also do more in future conferences sites in Denver and Long Beach to highlight the vital research by our members, which is impactful and connects with local activism. Fifth, as practitioners, we continue to be engaged in anti-racist activism and intersectional resistance in various forms. How can we do more to partner with groups and organizations to assist with building networks, conducting studies, tapping into funding, and directing our students in community-engaged projects, etc.? This means supporting community-led solutions for social justice that recognizes that coalitional solidarity has to be built and contextualized. One solution does not fit all. We need to be mindful that AAAS has gaps in terms of scholars representing certain disciplines. Those in law, education, urban studies, and public policy come to mind, but there are others. For example, the AAAS has not traditionally attracted scholars who specialize in mental health, probably because they have their own conference. With the Asian American community facing some major mental health dilemmas, how can the AAAS be more collaborative with the Asian American Psychological Association? Without sounding too transactional, admittedly, we know that the major structural issues the AAAS continues to face year after year is our inability to hire full-time staff that could enable us to be more innovative. Numerous AAAS boards have worked on creating an endowment and strategize on responsive practices to solicit funds from individuals and foundations and corporations, yet each one comes with their own predicaments. The AAAS board recently announced that the statement in the Wall Street Journal and along with other entities means that the AAAS will have new potential sources of funding for building a stronger financial foundation. The infusion of unrestricted or no strings attached funding gives the AAAS ways to address collective, sustainable, and targeted agendas. Just the possibility of improving the AAAS website to make it a useful and timely resource and to fully compensate staff can enable the association to be more vibrant and relevant. Having said all of this, I recognize that each of us are stretched incredibly thin with pressing matters related to our campuses, communities, and families. We're being asked to do more with much less and under conditions of heightened duress. And given the national headlines, we're being bombarded with an onslaught of requests to serve on committees, give talks, answer questions, or provide advice. This is creating additional burdens on the labor of faculty of color and on faculty women of color. There's also emotional labor to assist our undergraduate and graduate students who are living through uncertainty and thinking about their futures. Infused in the trauma, rage, anger, grief, heartbreak, and depression is the need for individual and collective healing and to brace ourselves for what is to come. In closing, let me say we've been dealing with unprecedented compounding events, and in the immediate future, we're still facing a Chauvin trial and the upcoming trial for the three additional officers, including Tu Thao. We cannot dismiss the implications of the racial imagery of Thao and what it represents about anti-Blackness within our ethnic communities. The xenophobic portrayal of China as threatening the American way of life, real and imagined, and COVID-19 scapegoating will continue. It is forcing the AAAS, scholars, and activists to be more focused and constructive to help resolve, mitigate, and lessen social injustices. Sometimes as scholars, dare I say, we're more inclined to be astute critics. Yeah, we also have opportunities to consider how we can be more proactive and refined when it comes to providing fundamentally productive, pragmatic, long-term, intergenerational solutions to the daunting challenges we face domestically and globally. We have the public's attention now, but we know it can be fleeting. So will we shape the public consciousness while processing what long-term collective justice, restitution, and reparations really looks like? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to begin by just maybe asking Craig, Min, and Linda to unmute. And is there something that you want to respond to each other's talks? Because there's so much richness. And I'd love to just start with a conversation among the three of you. There's a question by Amy Bong in the Q&A for Min, and I have a series of questions as well.
I was just going to address, I think what we all discussed, the three of us, was the issue of difficult conversations that we're having right now. Of course, we can say that we should have had them a long time ago, and we've been having them in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, Pacific Islander studies, but I think now we have a larger audience. But where do we take those difficult conversations, and how do we lead but not lead in some ways? Because I do want to be cautious that I do emphasize it should be community led. It shouldn't be from the top down, because we're all positioned differently, and we have to recognize that we are. But I just wanted to get a sense more what they were thinking about when we were talking about, because we all agree that the difficult conversations need to be have. How can we sustain those conversations?
I would just add to what you just said, Linda, and say, I'm always reminded that when I decided to focus on Asian American studies as my specialty in grad school in the early 90s, it was always accompanied by the assumption of others that it was a very minor field or a very niche discipline, and that we were studying a very slim population of marginal significance. And one of the things I've discovered in the years that I've actually been a professor working in this field and working with people in it is actually that it's the reverse. It is far from niche, it's far from marginal, it's actually central to many discussions, because we find ourselves constantly in dialogue with others, right? There's something about the focus on Asian Americans that brings us into conversation with really important discussions on migration and refugees. I find myself being pulled into really interesting and difficult conversations with people who work in post-colonial studies as well as Irish studies. Thinking about indigeneity, I think it's maybe one of the biggest developments in the field as far as I'm concerned. I find myself learning so much from indigenous studies, from Native American studies, from Pacific Islander studies, and how they are transforming our field and our sense of the kind of work we're doing. I can't emphasize enough how much I'm learning from scholars like Aaron Suzuki and Dean Serenilio and many others, and of course Craig, who's just been an incredible voice on that. We of course have had a long and painful conversation with African American studies, and I think that will continue. I think our interest in migration and borders and security also leads us to have important conversations with people in both Latinx studies as well as Latin American studies. And I've had some really terrific productive conversations with people who work in those fields and feel a sense of camaraderie with what they do. People who work on the Middle East on AFPAC and the endless war, the kind of stuff that Ronak Kapadia in particular has been doing such a great job with. It just speaks to the centrality of Asian American studies to these other bigger conversations. And so I do think we do struggle to sustain these conversations. It's wearing us down. On the other hand, it's also the case that I think Asian American studies is a kind of juncture point or crossroads where these conversations can happen. And I am hopeful that in the future, this will also be the case for environmental studies, that we will intervene in really important conversations in environmental studies. And I'm already having them myself in my own institution. I'm going to actually be on the steering committee of our environmental studies program, and I'm actually teaching a class in the fall, a freshman lecture class for first year students with an oceanographer. I'm really excited to do that. So I think these things are happening. I also think the work that Lolani Nishime and Kim Hester did on the edited volume Racial Ecologies is a really good model also, and that really helped me to develop the book manuscript that's coming here. And then, and then again, I want to reemphasize what an important figure Craig is in these discussions, and how he's also really done so much to bring Pacific studies into dialogue with us in such important ways. And I couldn't agree with you more, Craig, that we need dialogue, but we also absolutely need disaggregation. I find it especially annoying when organizations make statements about anti-Asian violence under the AAPI category, when so often they're not talking about Pacific Islanders at all.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you both. And I really appreciate both your talks and then those important questions about how to cultivate these difficult conversations. I think the organizers of this year's conference and the steering committee did a wonderful job to stage, trans-Pacific dialogue amongst us. And it's nice to see, quite a few Pacific scholars presenting and sharing their work at this conference. And I would love to see more of that in the future, and especially for, at least in terms of academic associations, I think are great spaces to stage these dialogues. And, I would love to see more, Asian American Pacific Islander conversations like this, as well as, of course, I know there are a few Afro-Asian panels this year and usually across the years. I'll definitely, when we do have that dream for Pacific Studies Conference, definitely advocate to have, several panels related to Asian American Pacific Islander conversations. And I think those other kinds of comparative conversations with, the Black Pacific, or, some called the Red Pacific, other kinds of solidarities across racial categories. I think it's so important right now, not only to address racism within our communities, but also to form stronger solidarities, because as both Min and Linda pointed out, whether it's issues related to the environment or social justice or militarization, it's all interconnected and intersectional. And I think, we don't have much of a chance to stand up to these greater forces unless we come together and unite both on local level, but also, of course, on the global level.
Thank you so much. Again, I just wish we could just really converse capaciously. I wish we were in person so that we could have people also comment and ask questions. We've got 3 questions so far. I did want to ask one question, and it sort of ties into the second one that we've received in the Q&A. And for everyone listening, please do use our Q&A function to ask questions, because I can't see the Accelerants chat. It would make me open up a second Zoom, and I think that would be terrible in terms of the feedback on the audio. So my question for all 3 of you is that, you've, in some cases, you've offered really concrete suggestions about sustainability, really kind of thinking about it capaciously. And again, I think this relates to the question we're getting about ethnic studies. And so my question for all of you is what can individual AAAS members do to enact some of these concrete suggestions that you have about environmental sustainability? I mean, let me just say, I actually am in favor of having an every other year conference, which I know for all of us who are feeling like we're missing in-person contact feels like the last thing in the world that we want. But the best practices for holding conferences is really to minimize flying. So the conference is in Denver, not because I now live here in Colorado, but because I wanted to advocate for holding the conference at an airport hub. Because if you're going to fly, the next best thing is to make sure that you can take a direct flight, which means choosing airport hubs. And so, Craig, when you said like maybe AAAS should think about every other year in-person conference, I was like, yes, I actually think we might need to really do that, as much as having conferencing online is not as desirable. But interestingly, we're going to try and make it work. So this could be kind of the test case for whether there is an appetite. I will also just say, and I'm sorry I'm talking so long, but because it was online and not physical, we were able to drop the costs of registration. So this also meant that there are many first-time attendees, particularly students, and those who are more financially precarious, who are able to attend. And again, I think I'm all in favor of that, because I know that the cost of flight and hotel can be really prohibitive for people to attend AAAS. So I'm going to shut up, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts about, kind of what can individual members do to kind of leverage whatever power they may have in increasing ethnic studies on our campus, and how can we enact some of these concrete suggestions that you have?
Can I just go first? Because there's a story I want to tell, and then I want to address the main point here. I've wanted to tell the story for a while. I was at a conference at Berkeley many years ago, and I was feeling guilty about going to the conference because it just felt silly to be traveling across the country for a few days. And this was when I was really starting to think about climate change as an issue for our field. And at dinner, I was speaking with another attendee who's from Southern California, and she was telling me about a conference that was going to be happening in her school, and she wanted me to come. And I'd been thinking all weekend about feeling guilty all weekend about going to this conference. And I said, I just don't want to come to conferences on the West Coast anymore. And then she got really angry at me, like, oh, you're an East Coast snob, which I am. But you're a real East Coast snob, and I felt terrible. And also I was really tired, and I didn't respond. I didn't correct her. I couldn't even articulate what I was saying. And so to this day, I can just imagine how angry she is still at me. But this is so it's really tricky to find the language to talk about this issue, right? And also because these conferences are really important for what we do. I mean, being there together in person. I mean, this is great. I love having this online opportunity given the circumstances, but it's not the same as being in person, right? I mean, a lot of the work that gets done at these conferences actually happens outside of the session. So we do lose something, right? So I do think it makes sense to do it every other year. I think we can augment that by encouraging more regional conferences so people aren't traveling so far. And I think the other thing we should be taking seriously, and I think a lot of schools will be doing this, is when you invite speakers, you don't have to fly them to your campus anymore. Just do a virtual meeting. We're all familiar with it. It's cheaper. You could do more people. You can, people can say yes to more. I think that culture is here to stay, and that's another way in which we can reduce our carbon footprint. But these are fairly minor things. I mean, what we're doing with these things is actually trying to set an example to others about the importance of thinking about these issues, of finding a language to talk about them. They don't really, individually, like if we held a conference every year, that's not going to contribute to the carbon budget that much. But we want to try to set an example, and we do these things because we want to call attention to these issues. And I think that's actually the really important part to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with Min in many ways. I have mixed feelings about not having in person. I think, if you're a senior scholar, not as big a deal, but for grad students, those just getting out, and for younger scholars, those moments that when you're not at the panel and you're at the conference, those are the moments I think that you make connections. And I said, I'm not in this case now, but I have been one of the only Asian Americanists in a small town on my campus. And I think going through the AAAS and making those connections and those friendships and gaining that support gave me for the rest of the year what I needed sometimes when I returned to my campus. So I do want to say it is important to have those face-to-face contacts in certain instances too. So I don't want to dismiss. But I definitely understand the idea of having more regional conferences or having hybrid formats, which is also the questions we're going to have on our campuses about teaching now, right? We're having those discussions. Do we want to continue some kind of online teaching? Do we want to do a hybrid model, or do we want to just go back to what we were, which was in-person teaching? And so those are the kinds of questions, because it saves on commute, saves on parking, etc. So those are the kind of small incremental changes that can make a larger impact. I just wanted to say about ethnic studies. One of the reasons that if you're on a campus where you're trying to promote ethnic studies, bringing in national scholars, giving prominence to the field is something that we've done. Then you have them meet with administrators on your campus. I think in building ethnic studies, we need to think about different ways. How do we do that and continue to build ethnic studies and have those dialogues, which both Craig and Min said, those cross-disciplinary dialogues. Can we continue to do it in a virtual format? And I say, yes, in some ways it does make a difference. Particularly, I've seen this with community organizing. You can organize on a national level, on a transnational level, and a global level through virtual organizing that we haven't had before. And in my community work, I like it a lot because I was driving across Southern California in rush hour traffic constantly to go to community meetings. And I don't have to do that. During the lockdown, we weren't going to meetings, but going to these meetings virtually has been really great for community organizing. And I think that's where it can be very, very useful. Even my undergraduate students, one of my undergraduate students, a Filipina, was saying that she was working with Gabriela Network and working with another organization, with Robin Rodriguez's organization up north, a Filipino-American archival website, Bulasan Center. And she was able to do that because of the virtual component of the labor she was producing and then the virtual component of organizing. So I see this in organizing that it can be particularly helpful in terms of using virtual and long distance Zoom organizing. So I'm sure Craig has, because he's where he's located, it allows him.
I don't travel to.
He's more insight on this.
Well, definitely, in terms of the conference, I think if it does move to every other year in person, I think in the odd years, there should still be a virtual, as I said, nearly carbon neutral conference, so you don't lose contact with people, as Linda mentioned. I think it's so important. In terms of pedagogy, I really think it's so important for every class, whether it's Asian American Studies, Ethnic Studies, Pacific Studies, to have some unit conversation about climate change and environmental justice. I know many classes already do, but some don't. And so I think that's one thing we can do in all our courses to really incorporate a discussion of environmentalism and climate change and sustainability. I think, the same is true for ethnic studies as well. I think, every university needs to have an ethnic studies program. Here at the University of Hawaii, we have a really good one. And, I think that kind of curriculum needs to be, in K through 12. And it's really exciting to see what's happening in California along those initiatives. And I think the same needs to happen for climate change education and environmental literacy. It needs to be interwoven, at every grade level, in every class, in every department, every discipline. And, as scholars, we need to find those connections, even if we teach a subject that might seem different, perhaps like mental health, but if we look further into it, we know there's such a deep connection between environmental justice and mental health. And so I think finding those connections, incorporating it into our courses is essential in these times.
Thank you. And let me just add, and I apologize for jumping in about this issue, but specifically the issue about ethnic studies, I think that I absolutely agree that it needs to be in the K through 12 level. And this is a question I've been getting in different interviews and workshops. So what I've been telling people, especially if you're a parent, is to talk to your school boards or, run for school council. That's a thing, right? Sorry, I don't have children. And really kind of insist that there needs to be ethnic studies curriculum. in the K through 12. Now, depending on where you live, this might be, tilting at windmills. Jason Oliver Chang right now is trying to do this in Connecticut. And I think, and again, not that you should flood Jason's email inbox with queries about this, but I think that looking at what he's doing, following him on Twitter to see how he's intervening in his role, and he is on the school board, is a great start, right? For those of us who want to try and make inroads in K through 12 curriculum. And I'm not sure what the world of independent schools looks like. Again, I don't want you to flood her email inbox, and I'm pretty sure she's on parental leave, but Kat Fung would be a wonderful person to ask about this, because she's teaching at Lick Wilmerding, and she and Marguerite are the conference co-chairs next year. So there are people, I think, who are on the ground who are really doing this work. And actually my question for you, Min, when you read that email or the letter to the dean, what was their response? Because I too have been really trying to educate up in higher ed. And I have to say this, and it's not a dig at my former employer, UNC Chapel Hill, but the support that I'm getting at CU Boulder is really off the charts. Like the provost just emailed me today because he heard that, I'm getting a wave of hate mail. And, I had the CEO of the CFO of CU Boulder also email me, letting me know that they're behind me, which is great, because they're also getting email messages to fire me right now.
I'm sorry to hear that, Jen. That's just awful what's happening to you. My dean sighed loudly and then said, "I guess we'll have to do something about this," at the end of the meeting. And I take that to be positive. I think he was sighing just because he had to listen to me read the say to him. I don't know why I felt compelled to do that, but it's been positive so far. Knock on wood. I think it's recognized as important. I feel like what I've done, is really try to marshal all the social capital I've accumulated at 20 years of teaching at BC. And I'm using it all right now, kind of going for broke, because I feel like this is the time to do it. I did want to add a couple of other things. I'm glad to hear that Jason is doing that work. It's so important, and he's amazing. And he's another person who's doing really important conversation, thinking also about the experience of the Chinese in Mexico. And I think that work is really important too. But I should also say that Peter Kang and Paul Watanabe at the UMass Boston is also developing and pushing for a K through 12 ethnic studies curriculum in the Boston public school system. So I think there's a lot of people who are working on K through 12 issues. And I think also public schools are leading the way. I mean, public universities are leading the way on this. And this is really great to see that energy. I just wanted to add one other thought I had as I was listening to Linda and Craig about the nearly carbon neutral conference idea, or alternating conferences. I wonder, another possibility might be for us to combine conferences with other organizations every other year, so that way we've at least cut out a conference by doing that. And it would facilitate this kind of difficult conversation. I don't know if that's the same as doing a nearly carbon neutral. Though I think in some ways, as we're seeing with the pandemic, at some point, we're not going to have a choice anymore but to go remote. Every year before the pandemic, we were seeing conferences getting into trouble because people were having trouble traveling. There were weather anomalies, planes were delayed, there were freak storms everywhere. At some point, we just will have to recognize, I think, that traveling long distances to attend anything is going to become more difficult. One of the things that for sure is happening with climate change is greater air turbulence. If you've noticed flying in jets, it's less smooth, and that's partly because of disruptions in the jet stream.
Can I just add to what we've been talking about in terms of educating in the ethnic studies, or even instituting Asian American studies in K through 12 curriculum? I think one of the things we need to also prepare for then is to educate those teachers. And that's a problem. I mean, we can pass policies to institute ethnic studies and Asian American studies, but we don't have teachers prepared to do so. And a lot of, let's say, education departments where the teacher training occurs do not have Asian American studies or ethnic studies specialists who are training in these areas. And these are BA programs or master's or PhD programs too. We don't have enough individuals to train in this way. So that is my concern. Not that you have to only be in the Department of Education. You can come out of Asian American Studies and then get your teaching credentials. But I think that is one of the areas we are unprepared for if we're really going to institute ethnic studies and Asian American studies at the K through 12 level. And that's another concern, other than the issues of the debate of the content, which we're having in California right now. There's been disagreements and debate about what is the actual content, what is the state going to allow, which is what actually educators and advocates actually want in an ethnic studies curriculum. So it's not smooth sailing in that way, but my concern, which is a good problem, I guess, that the Cal State system is having. Once they instituted ethnic studies, they're now getting FDE positions to hire more faculty in ethnic studies or Asian American studies. And this is a result of why these positions are available. But it also puts us in a kind of predicament, I think, because then it makes us just a teaching. We're just doing teaching, fulfilling breadth requirements. We're not an intellectually solid unit. And so it positions us in certain ways. And I'm in one of those institutions where we fill over 200 or almost 300 students in our intro to Asian American studies. It's because of the breadth requirement. But we lack majors. And you know that the way to get FTEs or more faculty is to have majors. And so we're kind of in this bind where we don't quite have enough resources to increase our majors. And we have the bare minimum to teach our undergraduate large intro classes, which takes a whole different level of energy to do. So I think there's, a nuanced way of trying to make sure, as much as we want to push for K through 12, and maybe this is the moment to do it, that we're also thinking about the other side of the preparedness, because it can be nothing worse than having someone teach Asian American studies or ethnic studies at the K through 12 level and doing it inappropriately, badly, I would say, or in a stereotypical way. So that's the other concern I have and are pushing for any kind of ethnic studies.
Thank you, Linda. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is such a thorny problem, in some ways a good problem to have, right? And I think we are equipped as Asian American and Pacific Islander studies scholars to think through all of this. So I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions, and I'm going to take Amy's bongs first, and I'm just going to read it out loud. Thank you, Min. I wonder what you make of environmental justice, largely marshaled by people of color, low-income activists, and organizers. While I recognize and often critique the subtler legal frameworks environmental justice movements are often constrained by, I do see the curricular possibilities of building out race, gender, anti-colonial environmental studies coursework under the imperfect placeholder of EJ. What do you think would be the challenges of taking this course of action to increase the amount of contact and connection among critical race and ethnic studies, gender studies, and environmental studies?
I 100% believe that environmental justice issues are crucial and important right now. We see evidence of it everywhere, the ways in which pollution and public health risks are disproportionately dumped onto Black and brown bodies. I especially admire the work that Julie C. is doing, her most recent book. I think it's called Environmental Justice in a Time of Danger. I could be wrong about that. It's a brilliant book and such an important one. And it also models the ways in which we can have difficult conversations across racial minority groups, where she's talking about, for instance, how the lack of clean water in Flint, Michigan can facilitate a conversation with the Latinx population in Central California, who've had serious problems with access to clean water. She talks about Hurricane Katrina and and the ways in which it was a kind of dress rehearsal for national responses to ever worsening hurricanes. And then there's a connection there to be made with the effects of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico. So there's something really important about that work, and I really support it. I do think there is some critique to be made from a settler colonial perspective, as Amy pointed out. I also think there is the danger too to think that when we talk about environmentalism and race, it can only be about environmental justice issues, that is a way in which that discussion can often get pigeonholed, you know, and I think within environmental studies circles that sometimes happens. And so we want to say that that's an important issue. We want to engage in how that gets framed. But we also want to make sure that's not the only issue that we talk about, that we're thinking in different frames, that we are also thinking about the contributions we make to the entire field of environmental studies and to the wide range of issues that they're talking about. And really to intervene in some of those discussions, because, you know, especially in the ways in which I think for a very long time, environmental studies has worked with a rather pernicious romanticization of indigenous populations has been a real problem for them. I mean, an absolutely horrendous problem that needs to be addressed, and that really an ethnic studies perspective can offer a lot to those conversations.
Thank you. Linda or Craig, did you also want to answer this question or comment?
Yeah, I would love to just mention, you know, I love Julie's book too, because it brings in the humanities, and she talks about various amazing literature and film as another way to talk about environmental justice. And of course, Min's work is so important in this regard as well. So I think as we take this intersectional approach, we have to always bring in the humanities, because so much important work is being done in telling climate stories and narratives of environmental justice. And as a poet myself, you know, I've obviously been involved in this kind of work. And then, you know, just to Amy's point, I think that's so important to think about also relationship between environmental justice and militarism and coloniality. I've written in the past about how certain conservation environmental justice schemes are being used in the Pacific to dispossess native lands as well as fishing rights. There's also been a lot of what I call blue washing in the Pacific, where ocean reserves or monuments and protected areas are also being used to protect military sites. And that's something that we need to be really critical of. So, you know, I would advocate for a critical environmental justice studies. And then to the last point that Min mentioned, especially for Pacific Islanders, are often now being used as the new charismatic species of the climate justice movement, as if we, you know, standing on our sinking islands are the new polar bears, basically. And it's really problematic to have that kind of representation of Pacific Islanders, even though it's brought a lot of attention to the Pacific. It can be very reductionist and stereotypical. And I think, again, we need to you know, critically examine those representations, both in the climate justice movement as well as in studies of the Anthropocene.
Great, thank you. Fuji Lazada has asked a question. What about Asian studies? I'm struck by Min's comments in terms of the intersections with many different programs. For sustainability, especially in liberal arts colleges where I am located, we need more breadth in teaching, plus topics like immigration, diaspora, et cetera. And I should also add that he also talked about the need for Asian studies to be in dialogue with Asian American studies, right? To get out of the kind of security origins, Cold War origins of Asian studies, and to kind of embrace a more social justice orientation. And let me just put in a plug for both Christine Yano and Tina Chen, because they have, so Christine Yano is a former board member of AAAS, and Tina has just won the mentoring award this year. Both are very active in doing this kind of bridge building.
Yes, I didn't mean to leave out Asian studies. It's important. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I think, making the connections with Asian studies is what we're trying. Well, the field, since Xiaoling Wang asked that question several decades ago, right? And we had the discussions about Asian American and Asian studies. And I think the field has changed tremendously during this period of time. But just thinking about environmental issues, it's very clear that the rising tide, right, of the oceans is impacting the Pacific coast here where I live, the erosion of the beaches and land, and also in the Pacific, of course, the Pacific Islands, but also in Asia. There are many countries who are already experiencing, so it doesn't read like a catastrophe, like a tornado or a hurricane, but the rising tide in all of these countries, which is impacting housing, ways of making a living, livelihoods, basically, health issues because of the pollution with the rising tides of water. So there's all kinds of issues that we're facing simultaneously because of climate change, or environmental, kind of what some have referred to as slow death, in fact, that is occurring in countries in Asia. In addition to the change in our foodways, right? And the decimation of green life, or ocean life too. These are all things I think that we share in common, and that we're understanding what is the impact, or in many ways, what's the cause of all of this. And we can see that so much of it is related to the things that have been mentioned: militarization, colonialization, capitalism in these environments that is causing in these areas on land and in our waterways and the oceans. It's damaging to all of us. I used to live in Richmond in Northern California. And so we would have the announcement that would be made. There was a loudspeakers in all of our neighborhoods in Richmond if there was a gas leak from the Chevron there, the announcement would come on. But just getting that into multi-ethnic languages, there's a large Lao population. It would only come on in English before, so they had to advocate to get into multi-languages. But it's not just in other places. It is in our neighborhoods, in our communities where we live. And so how do we think about that and make those connections, as Craig and Min have said, to the Pacific Islander communities and to the Asian communities in our local areas, but also in a more global context in connection to Asian studies?
Just one thing I'd want to add to what Linda said, thinking about the effects of climate change in Asia, I was also thinking in particular about how the Philippines has just been really inundated by cyclone after cyclone, that they've really become a frontline community and are as vulnerable as I'd say the Bangladeshis are right now. And I think there's a lot of wide understanding that Bangladesh is another frontline community. The Gulf is also a place we're focused on a lot, on the Caribbean. But I think also the Philippines is right in the pathway as other Pacific Islanders. Pacific Islanders also are also in the pathway, and I think it's really important to think about those effects. And I think the effects not only on populations, on food security, and other issues, but I think it's also to think about how these worsening effects will shape things like migration. I think that's an issue that I'm becoming increasingly focused on, because I think migration is a major factor in terms of what's going to happen. And then the second factor, I think just as important, is it's the destabilization of political systems everywhere. I think we've seen in the last few years the rise of far right movements, and there's lots of reasons why they've happened. One of the things, though, that seems to be a constant trigger is actually the increasing numbers of refugees and migrants moving across the borders from the global south into the west, and I think that's contributed a lot to the rise of a very coordinated far right movement. But I think also there's this specter before us, right? That one way in which people will respond to climate change, one way politically that countries will respond to climate change, is to turn more and more to authoritarian and even fascist forms of government, and I think that is that the fear of eco-fascism is a real concern, especially given, I think, the weakness of public understanding and support for democratic movements and democracy in general. It just seems like democracy everywhere is in danger.
Yes, I think very sadly, democracy everywhere is in danger. And, Min, I'm really struck by the comment you made earlier about, we may be forced into doing remote conferences. Because, I agree with you, like air travel has gotten so much worse in terms of turbulence. One of the things, and I really don't mean to be saying this when we are still trying to get out of COVID-19, but there will be more pandemics to come. This isn't going to be a once in a century phenomenon anymore. Sorry, everyone. I know that's really, this panel I know is a little bit depressing. But I also think, let's put us a little bit back on track and take one last question for our panelists, and maybe actually, because there's actually a lot of questions coming in, and I apologize. I don't know that we're going to be able to get to all the questions with just 5 minutes remaining. So instead of me being like doom and gloom and saying all of this, maybe in the last 5 minutes, if each of you can just say, is there something that makes you hopeful about sustainability? In spite of or because of the many challenges to our organization and to the planet. So I'm not sure, I didn't prep you to end on a hopeful note, and you can totally reject my asking you. But I think that what's important when we are faced with these kinds of multiple, thorny, complex issues is to think about, like, what is something that we can take away and we can do. Everyone's really quiet. Let me start, and then that'll give you all time to think. If you're on a college campus, if you're a faculty member on a college campus, I think something that you can do, and it relates to what Craig was saying, is get your administrators to disaggregate data. I absolutely agree, and I think Asian American Studies has for a long time been really thinking about its relationship to Asian studies and not wanting to do this kind of jingoistic, xenophobic, like, we're not Asian studies, we're not Asian, we're Asian American, claiming America kind of thing. But for the purposes of trying to intervene within power structures of our universities, I think it can be useful to ask administrators to try, if they can, to disaggregate data from those who might identify as Asian national, right? Like, born and raised in Asia, trained, did their PhD, are coming over here, did not grow up with anti-Asian racism, right? In the way that some of us have. And then further to disaggregate in terms of ethnicity, because I would hazard to guess that the number of Southeast Asian and Filipino faculty are pretty low. In most colleges and universities, right? So when I did this at UNC, they realized that, the line had been that Asian American faculty are overrepresented in UNC Chapel Hill. But when you separate the data out from the med school, especially, and then you actually are just looking at the College of Arts and Science, and then further, if you're disaggregating by discipline and then disaggregating by department, they realized, right? We had no Pacific Islander faculty. We had very small numbers of Asian American faculty in the humanities and the social sciences. And so it was another way to say, we need both more Asian American faculty in the College of Arts and Science. And by the way, we need people, regardless of how they identify, to be able to teach on these subjects.
Jennifer, can I just add to that? I just want to make sure that we, in some ways, can counter this kind of performative diversity that I see, that university administrators and corporate executives and representatives are using this moment to make statements about supporting Black Lives Matter or being against anti-Asian racism or attacks, which I think are simple things to do, right? But how can we pressure our institutions to do much more than provide lip service and tokenism to Asian American studies, whether we have Asian American studies on our campus or whether we have a small department or programs or we have one faculty or a few courses? What can we do to pressure them in different ways to do more than provide lip service to Asian American studies beyond that moment? And of course, I've already talked a little bit about having FTEs graduate students, et cetera. And I see them doing it with African Americans, and not to take away from that need and the necessity of doing much more. I think that we can also say that there is a need for Asian American studies to be part of an ethnic studies unit or to be part of a department, whatever structure. I do want to recognize that we're different in each institution. We can't say that one model can be applied across the board, but I do kind of irks me when I see this kind of, like I said, performative diversity, which does nothing for us, than put something on their website, the university or corporation. So
I would just add to the question you asked, Jen. I would say I try not to use the language of hope or hopelessness. I mean, many of us come from peoples who've experienced war, foreign occupation, dictatorships, grinding poverty. I mean, we know what it means to suffer. We've had plenty of that experience, and it doesn't, hope and hopefulness and hopelessness just don't factor into just the kind of, just the need to find ways to survive. And the only thing that's ever proven useful for people, I feel, is each other, is the resilience that comes from finding other people who you work together and struggle with and figure answers out together. And that's the only salvation we're going to find, I think. And that's why I think like AAAS is so important, because that's what we're doing. AAAS is trying to find that kind of work with each other. But I'd also say, the book that I've read recently that has had the biggest impact on me is Mariam Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Be Free, or Till We Free Us. And she makes this amazing, she's a prison abolitionist, a longtime activist who's also been someone who's been leading from behind and has just recently allowed herself to gain some prominence. But there's an interview in that book where she talks about the difference between activism and organizing. She says activism is like you feel something compelled and you do something about it, but you don't owe anyone anything. You're just doing it because of your own conscience. And you're just doing what you happen to think is best, but you don't owe anyone anything when you're an activist. You're not obligated to anyone. It also means that you're not responsible or caring for others, right? But organizing means working with others and all the headache that comes from working with others. But they force you, right, to that your actions then are obligated to other people, that you are part of a group. Right, and your decisions aren't your own. You have to work together as a group, and I've been thinking about that distinction since I read it, and it's something I hadn't ever thought about, and it just really seems to me that the one thing we all should be doing right now is organizing. That is really the most important thing that we can be doing right now.
Yes, I agree. I definitely, I find strength knowing our shared histories. Asian and Pacific peoples have survived so much, pandemics, genocide, displacement, and just thinking about the strengths of our ancestors, our parents and grandparents, and that strength keeps me going and really encourages me, as Min said, to continue organizing and joining our struggles today and finding solidarity with other communities. And I think that being in that struggle makes me feel resilient and to keep going. I do feel hope as well. I think hope is important. I just wrote a poem recently where I talk about hope as our most buoyant oceanic muscle. And so I think, being able to have moments like this where I feel like, where that muscle is being exercised and feeling stronger, that I can keep swimming as the seas continue to rise. And, if I just keep that hope alive, that, things will be better for my children and the next generations to come. And so thank you, all of you, for this really inspiring event. And I'm definitely looking forward to attending more of the sessions throughout the weekend.
I wish we were all together so that you could hear rousing applause for our three panelists. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in. I know we're over time. I know you've got to navigate the Accelerants website. Read Craig's work, read Min's work, read Linda's work, read each other's work. I put a ton of things in the chat. I wasn't able to capture everything, but yeah, we need each other. if we're going to survive. Thanks, everybody.